So we learned all of this from Abraham Zhuang.
Zhuang, I guess, yeah.
Because the article explained who he is.
Who is Abraham Zhuang?
A leader of this project.
He's the leader of the project. He's the manager. He's the guy in charge. But of course, it's a group project. It's a lot of people working together.
Yeah.
And we find out a little bit more about what the whole group is doing in the next sentence that says the group is not focusing on one time period, but instead is learning all it can about Taiwan's past. Very interesting stuff. So, yes, when we study history, sometimes people will focus on one time period or one part of history, say World War II or the time of Sun Yat-sen around 1911 when there was the big revolution in China, that kind of thing. No, they don't focus on one time period or one part of history, but all time periods. Basically, anything they can find
about Taiwan.
From the 1600s to the 1800s to the 1970s would be interesting to them. So they're focusing on many time periods instead of one time period. When you use instead, we're talking about this and not that, or this to replace that. For example, you might say, I thought I'd have a hot dog, but instead I'm going to have a hamburger. It's a big change. I just want everyone to know. So in place of A, I'm going to have B, or I'm going to have A, but not B.
这句稍微复杂一点，帮同学解释一下。Instead 这个副词表示取而代之，所以我们知道这帮人呢，并不是只锁定某个时代而已 ，not focusing on one time period instead， 而是呢是所有跟台湾有关的历史。所以我们用 instead 来表示，不是前面的点点点，而是后面的点点点，刚好和 instead of 这个介系词片语有点类似，但是又是相反的用法。Instead of 呢是不是，而不是的意思，所以最常见的用法就是 I want tea instead of coffee。所以我要的呢是前面的 instead of 后面的是不要的，我不要咖啡。所以同样啊，课文这一句也可以交换一下顺序，改写成 Instead of focusing on one time period, the group is learning all it can about Taiwan's past. Why do they say they're learning everything about Taiwan's past? I thought we learned everything in our high school.
All right, so they're looking at many periods of history, and we learn more about why, because it says that's because under the Guomindang, the KMT, for example, people were taught more about Chinese history than Taiwanese history. That's one of the changes that has happened more recently, of course, from about 1949 to the early 90s. Most of the education, or certainly the history taught in schools here, was about China and not so much about Taiwan. But because of political changes and things like that, more recently people have become more curious and interested and wanting to gather more information about the history of Taiwan on its own.
学生跟我应该都一样。Mike might not know this, but all the students and I know that the history class we have, there are Taiwan's history for a year, China's for another, and the world history on the third year.
Oh, really?
Of
World
high school.
history too? Oh,
yeah, so I think it's true that we study more about China's history.
Right, yeah.
所以可能这个什么唐末元明清之间的这些 dynasty of China.
All the different emperors and things like that. But how does that relate to Taiwan? Good question.
Really.
Now here's an interesting sentence. Now remember, we're learning about Taiwan history. These researchers around the world are gathering as much and any information they can about Taiwanese history, but who exactly are the researchers? This might be surprising. Most of the volunteers are in the US. They're in America and are scanning files in the US National Archives and Records Administration. Wow, so they're doing a lot of the research overseas, America being one of the big places. Of course, America's had a long involvement with Taiwan during World War II, of course, and then afterwards. So a lot of these records, a lot of these files are in American archives. An archive is kind of like a library, but just for historical records. You won't find books or magazines, but you'll find government documents, government records like that. And the people doing it, well, they're working hard, obviously. They're doing important work, obviously, but they're not getting paid. We know that because they're volunteers. A volunteer is a person who gives up their time to do a job, but doesn't do it for money. They do it just because they want to help. They want to improve something in some way. Well, that's great. So these volunteers are giving up their free time, maybe in the evening or on the weekends, to do this just to help history.
Yeah, so
cool.
Thanks to them, we get to see those files not in Taiwan.
Right.
Yeah, so 大家应该都知道 file， 大家用电脑或者是玩电脑做作业，你如果存在电脑里的档案呢，就是一个 file. And you might put all of your homework files into a folder， 就是一个资料夹。
You know what we call that? A file folder.
That's
There
smart.
you go. That's how you organize all your different important documents.
So 我们也可以造一句，比如说 My brother saves all the files and folders in this hard drive.
Okay.
Hard drive 就是这个硬碟。
Yeah.
But what do they do to make the rest of us that are not in the U.S. get to see those files?
Well, that's a great thing about computers. Most of the volunteers, as we mentioned, are in the U.S. They're scanning these files in the U.S. National Archives and records in administration. They're scanning the files. That's the important verb that we have to learn there. To scan something is basically to take something that might be printed and to put it into a computer, to digitize it. We use photocopiers and printers and fax machines and things like that to scan documents. Basically, the computer takes a picture of it, turns all that information in the picture into ones and zeros, turns it into a computer file, and then, of course, it can be saved forever. It takes no space. You can email it all over the place, and it's basically there as long as you want, and time and water damage or things that might damage paper files won't damage these files once they're scanned, once they're put into a computer.
That's good.
And others are doing another thing, aren't they?
Others
Other
are
volunteers.
searching through the UN archives and the management section.
Yeah, the United Nations, not the U.S., but the United Nations. Of course, another big government agency that we would find in New York City. That's where the UN
我们都
is.
知道，除了 U.S. 美国以外 there are other countries that have information about Taiwan as well.
Okay,
So
yeah.
other people will try the UN， 就是刚刚讲到的 United Nations 联合国的档案。The articles goes on by saying, by examining different records about Taiwan's past, the group hopes people can learn more about Taiwan's relationship with the world.
Very, very interesting. Taiwan's had an interesting relationship with the world, especially with some of the big countries, the big powers of the
Really?
world, the U.S., China, Japan before that as well. So there's a lot of good information out there about Taiwan that we would love to bring back here. So historians, researchers, students, anyone basically can find this information where it should be, here in Taiwan.
Perfect.
Yeah, there you go. We'll come back with a chat question.